Thank you everyone, a very good afternoon. Thank you for taking the time and coming over to listen to this lecture. I want to thank the organizers, the Department of Philosophy, Dr. Shinod and his wonderful group of students who've kept this series going. I've learned a lot from the lectures in this series, and I hope that this goes on, and especially I think that it should end with Shinod speaking. So I'm putting it on record here. Right, so all of you know, I mean, the title of what I intend to present is Theorizing the Political, Disciplinary Demands and Reflexive Self-Understandings. I'll begin by setting out the scope of the talk. The brief that Shinod gave me was to reflect on what is treated as knowledge within the practices of one's discipline. I believe it won't be an overreach to say that all disciplines have contesting theories and methodologies to target whatever it is that they seek to inquire, and that these may or may not emanate from within the concerns unique to their own discipline. Political science is not different in this regard. Further, the pluralistic nature of the discipline of political science and the nature of inquiries that branches within it privilege have been, it has been discussed in the two talks that have been presented in this very series by my dear and esteemed colleagues. So I'll attempt to speak about the branch or subgroup, if you like, of political theory, which despite being termed as obstinately philosophical by the political theorist Isaiah Berlin in his famous 1961 essay, finds itself housed in political science departments and not philosophy departments in universities across the world. Since then, political theory has done a lot of navel-gazing about its epistemic implements in conversation with philosophy, natural sciences, sociology, history, and so on. That has made it to reflect and think of the knowledge it privileges and its relation to other disciplines and their knowledge interests. I will first speak briefly about the uncomfortable place of political theory, at least in its very initial years within the discipline of political science. This discomfort is due to the professionalization of the discipline with the intention of making it more science-like, if not in all of its methods, at least in its self-assessment. This development presented a set of demands on political inquiry in general, but on political theory in particular, with regard to goals of knowledge and the methods of acquiring it, or in fact of conceptualizing knowledge in a certain way. I will then discuss a second set of demands that arose from the challenge from post-colonial studies. This demanded inquiring into epistemic biases of political theory and the centrality of colonialism in shaping the Western traditional canon. Consequential for our subject at hand, it raised demands for reflecting on the location of one's theorizing and the language of one's theorizing vis-a-vis the subject of one's inquiry. Though the first challenge precedes the second chronologically, both continue to push political theory, mostly separately, but also increasingly in the global north together, given that decolonization has now become a new axis of reconfiguring the discipline and social sciences in general. They push political theory to reflect on epistemic methods, its own implements and goals. So what I'm going to do is I'll venture into self-reflexive understandings that some political theorists from different theoretical locations have proposed on the subject in responding to these professional and epistemic challenges. The self-understandings in the title are the self-understandings of these political theorists, which are in themselves multivocal. I start with this schema of asking what political theory is, why are the challenges it responds to, because as the political theorist Wendy Brown has pointed out, to ask what is political theory is also primarily to ask about its constitutive outside, what political theory positions itself against and by what discursive means, and what it imagines itself not to be is key to answering this question. This is arguably because political theory more often than not sharpens itself against epistemological, stylistic and ontological conceits that denote its significant others. And here I quote Professor Brown, she says, for Socrates, it was the epic poets and sophists. For Machiavelli, the Christian moralists. For Hobbes, the scholastics. For Nietzsche, the moral theorists. For Weber, political ideologues. For Sheldon Wallen, Methodism. And for Isaiah Berlin, science. But political theory has, along with science, now also to, end of quote, political theory has now, along with science, now to wrestle against Enlightenment understanding of reason and its epistemic biases and exclusions. The picture I present here via these two broad challenges to political theory is by no means an exhaustive one, yet hopefully it will be a helpful picture of what political theory has come to understand as its subject of inquiry, modes of inquiry, and knowledge itself. So I'll begin first by talking about political theory as a normative exercise. The traditions of theorizing the political that existed across traditions, but those that especially dominated the canon of Western political thought, came under a stern attack with the rise of empiricism and positivism. 2 world wars later, and this is a very well known and obvious story, right? So 2 world wars later, political inquiry in which political thought dominated was severely questioned for its relevance. I use these historical details not to trace history of the discipline, something that speakers here have been expressly asked not to do. But I use them as entry points to highlight the junctures of serious self-reflections on the nature of inquiry about political theory. So within the English-speaking world, it was in the 1950s that decline of modern political theory became a topic of inquiry and discussion, with thinkers like David Easton, Peter Laslett criticizing the earlier eminent thinkers such as Carlyle, Sabine, Dunning, etc. The decline referred to the decline of traditional political theory, which was argued to be normative and inextricably linked to political philosophy. It was further charged that since the ancient political discourse drew no boundary whatsoever between political theory and political philosophy, the study of political theory had been restricted to the history of the ancients and their political thought. Students of the history of political thought know this as the perennial problems question. A parallel development to this was the specialization of the discipline and the demands of modeling the discipline for the modern needs. Though departments in Britain largely resisted the refashioning of their units as one that could possibly yield a scientific study of politics and chose to call themselves political studies, projecting a skepticism towards positivist promises to studying the social, most East European countries followed the American academic turn towards systematic and scientific study of politics. The Italian political scientist Giovanni Sartori, who was part of this initial dialogue and the founder of the first academic post in Florence under political science, recently recounted how in the 1950s, what we would call political studies gained the label that indicated a captive discipline. He recounts, and I quote, "What was the bone of contention? In retrospect and in the face of the quantification of political science, I have some regrets on having fought on the side of science. Yet at the time, it made sense to do so. To say political studies left us with an ordinary language, normal discourse, that gave no distinctiveness to the endeavor. In particular, it did not separate narrative from cognitive, largely dominated by juridical or historical approaches. So political science had a new start and became a field of inquiry in its own right about half a century ago, for we could not foresee the narrowness that the notion of science would acquire on American soil. The foregoing leads me to the question, what kind of science can and should political science be? He says, I have always maintained that the model should be economics." End of quote. I should reiterate in a different manner the point that I made before via Brown. I do not want to state that the reflexivity within political theory must come from pressures of the economic order, or more precisely the worldview it imposes on the academia, but that, and this is not an original observation, such an order is never unrelated to the methodological commitments it imposes. To this extent, the knowledge project of political theory is always political. Further, it's not a simple reductive correlation of economic political worldview and it's favoring a certain view of knowledge that is measurable and market friendly, but that it forces political theory to ask the Kantian question, what kind of political theory is made possible in such a zeitgeist? One pervaded by such a view of knowledge, or one that resists it? For a political theorist must ask, what are the pervasive ideas of my zeitgeist? And are its relation to the and what are its political goals and its relation to society? To return to the charge of being too normative, there are few responses I would like to discuss that reflect on the nature of knowledge and inquiry in political theory. Most representative of this is the 1961 Berlin essay that I have been referring to, in which Berlin argues that the certification of a demise of a discipline can be made either because its central presuppositions, empirical or metaphysical or logical, are no longer accepted because they have, with the world of which they were a part, withered away, or because they have been discredited or refuted, or because new disciplines have come to perform the work originally undertaken by the older study. Since neither had occurred in the case of political theory, the demise talk, he argued, was misguided. For him, the only two classes of problems to which men had succeeded in obtaining clear answers were ones that could be answered by observation and by inference from observed data, the empirical, and the second were where given certain propositions and axioms together with rules for deducing other propositions from them, one could proceed by mere calculation, that is the formal. Natural sciences or behavioral sciences could be cited as examples of the former, whereas mathematics and logic can be cited as examples of the latter. However, what distinguished political theory, he argued, were the kind of questions that it asked. For whereas in empirical and formal inquiries, one had a hold of what kinds of methods are appropriate in looking for the answer, what kinds of answers are relevant to these questions, even if they are not true. This was not the case with political inquiry. The subject matter of political theoretical inquiry for Berlin were identifiable at best as vague or in dispute, its methods of argument and minimum qualifications as generally not agreed. He says, and I quote, "When I ask, why can I not be in two places at once? Why can I not get back into the past or to move to another region? What is justice, or is justice objective, absolute, etc.? Or again, how can we ever be sure that an action is just? No obvious method of settling these questions lies to hand." These for him are hallmarks of a philosophical question, where there isn't any automatic technique, no universally recognized expertise for dealing with such questions. Neither induction, in its widest sense of scientific reasoning, nor direct observation appropriate to empirical inquiries, nor deduction demanded by formal problems seem to be of help. In this view, the first step to the understanding of political humans is to focus on the patterns that dominate and penetrate their thought and action. The thinker tries to make a mental model of these patterns. To make men aware of the categories in which they think can be an annoying and unpleasant exercise, likely to produce deeply disquieting results. But this is the fundamental way to proceed as per this view. The second task is to analyze the model itself, the model of one's own reading and interrelation of human thought and action. A normative political theorist must be committed to the analysis that may require accepting, modifying, or rejecting it, and in the last case, even replacing it. In this, it subscribes to the idea of revisability of knowledge. Thus, for Berlin, like Sheldon Wallin before him, theorizing itself is inevitably a less economical way, vis-a-vis methodism, to which empiricism or formalism is committed, of arriving at truth or truth-likeness. Such a view leads one to see political theory as a humanities enterprise, one in which the education of the self and the other is the outcome being sought, not research, new knowledge, but the training itself. Though the political theorist is dealing with both facts and values, what is being sought in terms of knowledge is not cause and effect, but meaning and significance. The kind of knowledge such a view of political theory leads to is in the form of judgments, which accepts the limits of possible certitude. There can be a better or worse judgment, and though there may be no definitive interpretation, there are some interpretations that are more plausible than others. The task of political theory then is to establish more plausible interpretations of the political. Such a view of judgments is not without rational foundation, but its major source is reflection on the gap between intellectual activity and the practice of living. The realm of political theory thus must treat its knowledge not just as cognitive, but also as primarily participatory. What does all this epistemically imply? 4 points. First, it is first to understand that when we say that political actors are acting for a reason, this reason is itself a judgment of the meaning and significance of various factors under consideration in the situation. Second, political theory must grant these conscious rationales status of causal factors for an account of politics that cannot explain the self-understanding of political actors is radically incomplete. Third, a fuller account of how judgments are made, how they influence events, and how they should be must admit that politics is learned through accumulated practical experience in particular circumstances. These lessons of experience are applied at least as much through a process of reasoning by analogy as they are through deductive logic. This is because analogy proceeds through judgment of the relative significance of features of similar but never identical situations. Similar but never identical situations are the kinds of situations that arise in the political. To understand the choices of political actors and to anticipate their probable consequences requires attention to particularity and contingency. Final point, this can then help the theorist in identifying the presence of a pattern or structure in the behavior of people. The way we identify this pattern is to gather information about what episodes and situations in the world cause an agent to prefer that one rather than another sentence to be true. This information can be gleaned without knowing what the agent's sentences mean. But once we have enough such evidence, we can make the crucial step from the non-propositional to the propositional, from the non-intentional to the intentional. Now, establishing intention and reading in it pattern between rationality, truth, meaning via language is thus important to political theory. The sites of reading these patterns, however, don't have to be restricted to texts. And with this I want to move on to the second self-understanding of political theory, not as a normative but as a critical activity. Unlike normative political theorists, a critical political theorist thinks that questions of political theory don't have to be exclusively normative, but that primacy be given to practices, especially those of governance. Studying these practices too can facilitate a form of philosophical reflection on experiences that are oppressive in some way and are called into question by those subject to them. The aim here is not to develop a normative theory as the solution to the problems of this way of being governed, such as a theory of justice, equality, or democracy, but to disclose the conditions of possibility of our contemporary, historically singular set of practices of governance and of the range of characteristic problems and solutions to which it gives rise. It is to read the contemporary right. This should not be confused as the desire to arrive at an ethnographic thick description aimed at clarification and understanding for its own sake. Rather, it seeks to characterize the conditions of possibility of the problematic form of governance in a new vocabulary. This redescription is meant to transform the self-understanding of those subject to and struggling within it. It is to enable subjects of governance to see its contingent conditions and the possibilities of governing themselves differently. Hence, it is not only an interpretative political philosophy, but also a specific genre of critique or critical attitude towards ways of being governed in the present, an attitude of testing and possible transformation. This practical and critical objective is achieved in two steps. The first is a critical survey of the languages and practices in which the struggles arise, and various theoretical solutions that are proposed and implemented as reforms. This survey explicates which forms of thought, conduct and subjectivity are taken for granted or given as necessary, and so function as constitutive conditions of the contested practices and their repertoire of problems and solutions. The second step broadens this initial critique by using a history or genealogy of the formation of these specific languages and practices as an object of comparison and contrast. This historical survey has the capacity to free us to some extent from the conditions of possibility uncovered in the first step, and so to be able to see the practices and their forms of problematization as a limited and contingent whole. It is then possible to call these limits into question and open them to a dialogue of comparative evaluation, and thus to develop a perspectival ability to consider different possible ways of governing this realm of cooperation. Finally, this way of doing political theory sees the hard-won historical and critical relation to the present not stopping at calling a limit into question and engaging in a dialogue over its possible transformation. As James Tully, the political theorist, argues, I quote here, "The approach seeks to establish an ongoing mutual relation with the concrete struggles, negotiations and implementations of citizens who experiment with modifying the practices of governance on the ground. This is not a matter of prescribing the limits of how they must think, deliberate and act if they are to be legitimate, but on the contrary to offer a sketch of the arbitrary and unnecessary limits to the ways they are constrained to think, deliberate and act, and of the possible ways of going beyond them in this context." One could turn to Habermas to explicate the theory of knowledge, underlying one of the many inspirations, and I underline one of the many inspirations behind these kinds of self-understanding within critical political theory. It recognizes that Enlightenment era political forms have their own forms of unreason and thus underlines their subjugative aspects, but some strands within it also participate in the revisionary project of enlightenment while taking notes of the defects of enlightenment. What is at work is a broader notion of rationality than one proposed by enlightenment. Most centrally, it internalizes the Habermasian understanding that the beginning of knowledge is always associated with human interests rather than being available a priori and outside human interest for objective inquiry. The realm of social sciences, but especially political theory, is the freedom interests that drive knowledge or inquiry, and though governance systems are increasingly working with techno-bureaucratic empirical rationalities furthering the control interests of knowledge, political actors operate in the realm of communicative and interconstituted reason. It is this social hermeneutical knowledge that the critical political theory essays to reinstate. I now turn to the post-colonial turn in social sciences, which initiated in cultural theory and focused on a critique of hegemonic and Eurocentric imperial discourses, which too critiqued not only the analytic neutrality claimed by positivist methodology, but also and more importantly the value neutrality in the universal normative claims made by Western social sciences and its interpretative methods. This kind of thinking led to some interesting self-introspection beyond the critique of Eurocentrism in political theory from the non-West or the global South. I will discuss two such self-reflexive analytical moves from India that have problematized the way of articulating and reifying political experience in the subcontinent. I call this one historical trajectories and conditions of translatability. Political theorists have usefully reflected on the language by which we try to open up the world of political facts in post-colonial contexts to reassess what should be the consideration of social theories in these societies. Professor Sudipto Kaviraj has demonstrated that contemporary political theories draw on historical proceeds as if language does not exist. In this, he says, we commit an epistemic neglect. Language intercommunication and its rationality is important across actors, but its interaction across histories mitigated by culture, power, time is what this strand of theorizing, if I may be so bold to call it a strand, thinks social theorists in general must pay a very close attention to. The assumption of pre-translative equivalence is challenged by bringing into question the limits of analytical philosophy and philosophy of language to introduce the social complex of concepts that often deny the rules of meaning transference. First step in this is to acknowledge that the reality of doing political theory from non-West is very different from doing philosophy in the West. The latter is a text-closed world. All interaction can happen with reference to and in texts, whereas the political theory or even political philosophy in the non-West must rely on a text that's never closed and a realm of communication that is deeply non-textual. Further, and I quote Professor Kaviraj here, we work, whether we formally acknowledge it or not, at the inexplicit intersection of two languages at least, in the vernacular in which people live and do their politics, and English, the academic language in which we write about it. End of quote. The analytic philosophers, by contrast, work in a single language world. The world of a political theorist is not just bilingual but also translative, and thus neither historically nor philosophically unworried. Linguistic translation is asymmetrical and thus rarely produces identical meaning or equal value. But to surmise that there could be a translation-like element in our access to the social world that we study evokes what he calls specters of epistemic estrangement. It is to work with this that then becomes the task of political theory. The integration of the implication of the linguistic nature of all social happenings for political events or political facts then become the way to access theory. One implication of this insight will be to acknowledge that just as all occurrences in which social facts occur have not just spatial and temporal coordinates, but also irreducible linguistic coordinates. To do this is to invoke natural language for social facts, the language that is involved in the exchanges between those specific social agents. Kaviraj uses frames of natural or scientific reference via Quine, social reference, which would be about institutional facts via John Searle, to show their limitations, and then proposes what he calls a historical reference or a projective reference. The problem, he says, cannot be resolved via scientific or natural reference, because in the famous Quine example, if I am trying to communicate the word rabbit to someone who does not speak the same language as I do, I can point to them to a rabbit hopping out of a bush and they can say the word in their own language, and we can hope that some kind of equivalence may be established. But our problem is with categories and especially social categories in which such reference does not work. So how does one translate a social category or a social role? To work again with Kaviraj's own example, what does it mean for an English using person to understand the work of a Purohit via its translation as a Hindu priest? Correct meaning transfer would require historical congruence between English as a natural language and a religious life which is based on Christian practices. However, that rarely occurs. Across disciplines of social sciences, we work with something abstractly called religion, nation state, democracy, and so on. Some features of these abstract terms are similar, but what must be asked are questions of whether similar means identical or analogous. If it is the first, that is identical, then we are saying that the Purohit in Bengal and the pastor in England are performing the same function. If we are saying the second, we are saying something much weaker, that they are performing functions in their societies which are analogous. To make this second weak claim is to recognize the structured system of actions which we call religion are different in these two cases. Historical in this understanding serves to show that social acts are a complex that form and become habitual over time. They can also change over time, and since different societies have different historical trajectories, initial transfer of social political terms across historical borders is unavoidable. That is to say that Hinduism and Christianity have a priestly class of people is unavoidable, or that Pandits or Purohits are priests is unavoidable, but social terms like Purohit or pastor make sense in terms of meaning and significance in their own cultural historical context. When the vernacular social clashes with a vernacular made universal social, as in the case of Europe, these terms are taken out of their context and applied to another to which they do not belong. This creates a problem of a peculiar kind. When we mean Purohit, we should not say priest. Saying that in Bengal, and this is a quote from Professor Kaviraj, saying that in Bengal priests go to their clients and perform worship of deities is to say what we do not mean, end of quote. Or when one thinks of political parties in India as across the conservative progressive axis, one is not just saying but neither thinking what they intend to. Such dissonance has two possible effects. The first one is that since the semantic contents of the two concepts are different, they both produce effects partially cancelling each other. And the result will be then what we hear priest, when we hear priest in the Indian context, we would be barred from having a clear conceptual picture. It would produce a blurry overlap, like a double exposure, in which, because we see both the pictures, we cannot see any of them clearly. To put it more sharply, because both the concepts have social features as their content, we would think that the term priest must carry some of the features of the Christian priest, while we already know that it must also carry some features of the Indian Purohit. There is, however, a second more interesting possibility that this view points out, which is that slowly the features of the English Christian concept of the priest will completely override and then displace the features of the Indian Purohit. In both cases, the terms perform some referential work, but of two quite different orders. In the first case, the reference is blurred or vague. In the second place, it's clear but displaced. Political theory thus has to be aware and live to the effects of thinking in English about the social world of India. SK summarizes it beautifully when he says, and I quote, "The references actually make European characters walk in the scene. Our social world starts getting filled up by ghosts or specters, characters which make vivid conceptual sense but lack real world reference." The dissonance, however, is not just limited to social categories of thinking, but to philosophical and metaphysical ways of thinking about Indian political thought and political life as well. In asking the questions about what kind of social knowledge is produced when we suspend the European conception of time, space, or the conditions of necessity in defining causations are replaced by a concept like vyapti or relations of pervasion, are some of the many interesting epistemological inquiries via Indian political thought that may and should drive Indian political theory. The reference here is to the works of Professors Prathama Banerjee and Sundar Sarukai. So finally, I want to move on to the questions of ethics and experience and how they shape epistemic inquiry to political theory. With the sharper and sharper articulations of the domain of the political knowledge being essentially participatory and interconstitutive, the questions about the terms of this participation, not just across time and geographies, but even amongst social groups, have been brought under reflection in political theory. I am referring here to the issue of the translatability of experience into or for building political theories, not just along the colonial colonized axis, but across experiences of epistemic exclusions, among other more important exclusions of caste, gender, ethnicities, and so on. At the heart of the problem is the validity of first-person accessibility of experience, especially social exclusionary experience, if that access is not one that is lived. What is at question then is not just the limits of participation, but also the ethics with which a political theorist must use lived experiences of others and probably their own that they are theorizing about. Virginia Skaka, Gopal Guru, among others, have pointed out and resisted the tendency in Indian social sciences to turn certain entities into empirics or ethnographic sites for the theorists who do not share the experience. In doing this, Guru and Sarukai have tried to shift the view of experience as a predetermined social political category, as documented and analyzed by a theorist, to experience as a placeholder of common sensory experiences of what gets called a caste, and to build a theory upon it. This view looks at being a subject as just one part of the experience. Rather, the operational part is that something experienced by a subject and an experience about a subject must be distinguished from an experience of a subject. This is because the view holds that experiences such as that of Dalit life are neither voluntarily participatory to be described via a by, neither are they authorial to be described via about. The implications of this for the theoretician then is to take the autobiographical as a serious source of knowledge. However, there is an obvious problem here of privileging the autobiographical experience, which is an empirical, over the non-empirical axis of the theoretical. To avoid enforcing the cliched modernist view that depends on the empirical theoretical dichotomy to generate objective knowledge, the view demands then that ethics be an integral part to the act of theorizing itself. If so, then lived experience becomes the ground for such ethical intertwinement with theory. What does making ethical integral to theory in general and to political theory mean? In asking for theory to be essentially related to experience, the view asks for a reason to be essentially yoked to feeling, emotions and such terms. This yoking is not at the level of legitimacy, that is, it is not being claimed that it is epistemologically illegitimate to not relate reason to emotion, but to be able to see when required that experience and reason are in some sense ontologically related, that is, they are related as facts of the matter. That is the reason why this view expresses an ethical component in this relation. That is, it is ethically wrong to theorize about experience A when one has not experienced the same oneself, and B until one is a moral outsider to the experience. Needless to say, this is a difficult position to grasp. However, in terms of the problematization of the sites of knowledge production, and its asking of social sciences to correct inequities inherent in its knowledge systems, a sociological experiment to democratize the site of knowledge production was undertaken by Guru and Sarukai. Most of you may be familiar with it. This was the Jati Samvada that was conducted during the first half of 2013 in the Kannada daily Prajavani to explore how can collectively thinking about caste be undertaken, and through this ask whether it was possible for the public to challenge established beliefs about concepts such as caste, democracy and privacy. Every week, a few articles written by these scholars and people in specialized areas such as theatre, films and activism posed various themes and questions which were published seeking public responses. These responses sought in the vernacular were then also published alongside the articles. A public archive of people recounting and reflecting on their caste experiences was gathered and then put online. The reflections on this exercise and thinking about the larger questions in the light of this exercise were then used to think more ethically about experience and theory. The questions of experience and the ethical has come to resurface in the very recent debates about the trend of Indian academics abroad or academics abroad working on India, doing participatory observation-based research by paying a meager amount to students based in universities in India. In this transaction, the local student does the participation-based observation and the academic embedded sociologically, politically and pedagogically far from the field, analyzes these observations and builds frameworks based on them, thereby operating on a doubly divorced experience. Here, the question that warrants discussion is, even if the exercise of this practice is arguably unethical, does it necessarily produce political theories that are invalid or ones that do not produce correct meaning and significance? Or, following Guru, is the ethicality of practices, especially ones related to experience, the test of a theory's truth-likeness or a theory's getting the political right? One is asking the Rorty kind of question of solidarity or objectivity in asking this question. Anyway, so in summary, I would say that for political theory, the subject at the heart of its inquiry is human conduct and thought, recorded in the expanding and continuously expanding canon, the expression, subjugation and faults of reasoning as expressed in the political subject or obscured in relation to the political subject, the reflections on the historical and linguistic construction of this thought and conduct, and finally the ethical and moral location from which one accesses this thought. But it's also quite compulsively also an act of a second order inquiry of its own epistemological implements. In this, it is quite philosophy reliant. The implements used for these exercises may vary from observing social facts, for example human rationales as the initial causal, reasoning by formal but also non-axiomatic methods, interpretation, methods of linguistic reference and conditions of coherence, phenomenology and ethics, and again this is not an exhaustive list. But in these exploits, it is also philosophy plus. What I mean is, in this it is more confident and diverse about what its questions are, where to look for their answers, and why and what are the caveats that one must imbibe in thinking through and theorizing the political.